My name is Regina, and for the longest time my name felt like a title I held rather than a person I was. I was Regina, wife of Arthur, Regina, mother of Michael and Jennifer, Regina, caretaker of the house on Elm Street. The roles piled up over the years like layers of dusty varnish until I could barely remember the grain of the wood underneath. It took my husband's death to strip all that away, and what was left was not what my children or even I expected to find. Arthur was a quiet man. His voice was a low murmur, like bees in a distant clover field, and his hands, though calloused and stained with earth, were gentle. He spoke the language of soil, of sunlight and water, more fluently than he ever spoke of stock portfolios or property values. Our garden was his cathedral, a sprawling testament to a faith I didn't fully understand until he was gone. He'd spend whole days out there, from the first hint of dawn to the last blush of twilight, notebook in one hand, a trowel in the other, whispering to his roses. I thought it was just a hobby, a beautiful, time-consuming passion. I was wrong. It was his life's work. When he passed, the silence he left behind was immense. It wasn't empty, not at first. It was filled with memories, with the scent of him on his old flannel shirt, with the weight of his absence in the other side of the bed. But that peaceful, grieving silence was soon shattered by the noise of my children. Michael and Jennifer arrived within hours of the funeral, their faces composed in masks of dutiful sorrow, but their eyes were sharp, calculating. They were like birds of prey circling a fresh kill. Michael, my son, a man who wore his ambition like a suit of armor, started first. He walked through the house with a proprietary air, tapping the mahogany dining table. He said with a sigh that was meant to sound weary but only sounded greedy, "Dad really kept this place in good shape. The property value in this neighborhood has skyrocketed." Jennifer, my daughter, whose life was a curated collection of expensive tastes and casual cruelties, scoffed. "The house, Michael, honestly, the real value is in the portfolio. Dad's tech stocks from the 90s are the golden goose." They began to argue, their voices rising, slicing through the delicate quiet of our home. They stood in the living room, surrounded by the life Arthur and I had built, and carved it up like a Thanksgiving turkey. The house would go to Michael, he reasoned, because his family needed the space. The stocks, Jennifer insisted, should be hers, to compensate for the emotional labor of being the one who lived closer. They bickered over Arthur's first edition books, my grandmother's silver, the grandfather clock in the hall that had chimed on every important moment of their lives. I was just part of the inventory. I was the occupant, a problem to be managed. "Mother can stay in the house for a year or so, of course," Michael said magnanimously, not looking at me. "Give her time to downsize. We'll find her a nice condo, something manageable. A retirement community would be better," Jennifer countered, pulling out her phone to scroll through glossy websites. "They have activities and on-site nursing. It's the responsible thing to do. We have to think about her final arrangements." Her final arrangements. I was 72 years old, in perfect health, and they were talking about me, as if I were already a ghost haunting their inheritance. They looked at me, but they didn't see me. They saw a liability, a temporary custodian of their assets. They treated me like a piece of antique furniture they were waiting to claim, a fussy old chair that had to be tolerated until it could be reupholstered or sold. It wasn't just hurtful, it was a profound erasure. It was in that moment, listening to them debate my future, as if I had no say in it, that a tiny cold seed of something I hadn't felt in years began to sprout in the barren soil of my grief. It wasn't about revenge, not then, it was about survival. While they were inside, inventorying my life, I stepped out into the garden. Arthur's garden. It was late spring, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming life. I walked past the familiar constellations of hydrangeas and lavender until I reached the heart of his kingdom, the rose beds. And there it was, his masterpiece, a single magnificent bush that was different from all the others. He called it, only to me, the Crimson Legacy. It was a rose of impossible color, a red so deep and velvety, it seemed to drink the light. The edges of the petals were tipped with a sliver of the purest black, like a line of charcoal drawn by an artist's hand. It was a color I had never seen in nature. Arthur had spent over a decade on it, crossbreeding, grafting, using techniques he'd documented in dozens of leather-bound journals. He was a brilliant horticulturalist, a genetic artist, and this rose was his Sistine Chapel. My children never noticed it. To them it was just another flower in a garden that was, to their minds, just part of the property. They saw the assets, but they never saw the value. And as I stood there, the setting sun catching the dark edges of those impossible petals, I realized something. They were fighting over the frame. They had no idea about the masterpiece it contained. That was the day I stopped grieving what I had lost and started planning to protect what I still had. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in filial neglect. They'd call but not to ask how I was. The conversations were always probes, little fishing expeditions. "Mother, have you found Dad's will yet?" Michael would ask, his voice strained with false concern. Jennifer and I were just thinking it would be wise to get a clear picture of the estate. Jennifer was more direct. "Mom, you need to let us help you with the finances. It's too much for you to handle alone." What she meant was, it was too much for me to control. They had lived their entire lives with a sense of profound entitlement. It was a weed Arthur and I had. I now realized allowed to grow unchecked in the garden of our family. Michael, the firstborn, was praised for his pragmatism, which was really just a well-packaged form of selfishness. We paid for his MBA, co-signed the loan on his first oversized house, and celebrated his every minor corporate promotion as if he'd cured a disease. Jennifer, the artistic one, had an allergy to responsibility. Her careers as a freelance consultant was a flimsy excuse for a life funded by a steady stream of cash from the bank of Mom and Dad. A new car because her old one was creatively stifling. A trip to Bali to find herself after a breakup. We had always given in. Arthur, bless his gentle heart, hated conflict. "Just keep the peace, Regina," he would murmur, signing another check. "It's easier." I see now that we weren't keeping the peace. We were funding a war against our own dignity. We were teaching them that our resources, our lives, were theirs for the taking. The flashbacks came unbidden, sharp and painful. I remembered Jennifer's wedding, a lavish affair we paid for. She'd complained that the champagne we'd chosen wasn't the brand her future mother-in-law preferred, creating a scene in front of the caterer. I remembered Michael at a Christmas dinner explaining to the whole family how our outdated investment strategy was costing him potential inheritance, as if our retirement fund was his personal savings account. There were so many instances, a long beaded string of casual dismissals and greedy assumptions. They never saw us as people. They saw us as a resource. And now that Arthur was gone, I was the sole guardian of that resource, and they were circling, impatient for the guardian to fall. My best friend, Beatrice, a woman with a spine of steel and a laugh that could scare away crows, saw it all. She came over the week after the funeral with a casserole and a bottle of scotch. She watched me stare blankly at the wall as I recounted the conversation about the condo. She didn't offer platitudes. She just poured two generous glasses, pushed one into my hand, and said, "The little vultures. I always knew they had dollar signs for eyeballs." "They're my children, Bea," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "And you're their mother, not their bank," she retorted. "Arthur spoiled them. God rest his soul, and you let him. You both thought you were buying their love, but all you bought was their expectation." Her words were harsh, but they were true. They landed like stones in the murky pond of my sorrow, sending out ripples of clarity. It was Beatrice who, a few days later, sat with me in the garden as I cried. I wasn't crying for Arthur then. Not really. I was crying for myself, for the woman who had allowed herself to become so small in her own life. I pointed to the crimson legacies and told her Arthur's story about his obsessive quest for that perfect, impossible flower. She looked from the rose to the stacks of Arthur's journals I'd brought out onto the patio. "Regina," she said softly, her usual gruffness gone. "What are those?" "Arthur's notes," I said. "Decades of them. His whole process is in there." She picked one up, flipping through the pages filled with his neat spidery handwriting, complex diagrams of genetic crosses, and pressed petals. "My God, Reggie," she breathed. "This isn't a hobby. This is science. This is art." She looked at me, her eyes sharp. "Your children are fighting over the furniture. Have you ever considered what this might be worth?" That was the catalyst. It wasn't a lightning bolt of anger or a sudden thirst for revenge. It was her question, hanging in the quiet air of the garden. What might this be worth? Not in money, not at first, but in value, in legacy. My children were trying to erase Arthur's legacy, boiling it down to a number on a bank statement. They were trampling over his soul's work to get to his wallet. The next day, while Michael and Jennifer were exchanging passive-aggressive emails about who should be the executor of the will they hadn't even seen yet, I made my first call, not to a real estate agent, not to a financial advisor. I called the botany department at the state university. I asked a simple question: who is your leading expert on rose hybridization? They gave me a name, Dr. Eris Thorne. That evening, I got the email. It was from Michael, but Jennifer was copied on it. The subject line was family meeting. The email was brief and chillingly corporate. "Mom, Jen and I feel it's time we all sat down to discuss the next steps and finalize your arrangements for the future. We've taken the liberty of scheduling a meeting at the house next Saturday at 2 p.m. Please have all of Dad's financial documents ready. Finalize my arrangements." They might as well have been talking about a piece of cargo. They were no longer asking, they were informing. That night, the grief finally receded, replaced by something cold and hard and clear. It was a feeling I recognized from my youth, a stubborn refusal to be pushed. I looked at their email, then at the phone number for Dr. Eris Thorne. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself as I picked up the phone. But as I heard the clinical tone of my son's words echo in my head, a new thought followed, unbidden and sharp. It wasn't about revenge until it was. I realized they had left me no other choice. To protect Arthur's memory, to protect my own life, I had to stop playing by their rules. I had to create my own. The meeting with Dr. Eris Thorne was a study in contrasts. His office at the university was a chaotic jungle of potted plants, scientific journals, and complex diagrams taped to the walls. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his early 30s, with an intensity that radiated from him like heat. He had kind eyes but a skeptical mind. When I first described the Crimson Legacy, he listened with polite, professional patience, the kind a doctor reserves for a patient describing a self-diagnosed rare disease. "Mr. Arthur's work sounds fascinating, Mrs. Miller," he said, calling me by Arthur's last name, which felt both right and wrong. Many amateur horticulturalists achieve wonderful results, but a genetically unique hybrid with a stable black pigmentation, that's something of a holy grail. It's notoriously difficult. The anthocyanin pigments required just don't express that way naturally. I didn't argue. I simply opened my tote bag and placed one of Arthur's journals on his desk, open to a page showing a detailed molecular diagram of a pigment chain. Then from a small velvet-lined box, I took a single perfect bloom of the Crimson Legacies that I had cut that morning. The shift in him was immediate and electric. He leaned forward, his professional skepticism dissolving into pure, unadulterated awe. He gently took the rose, his fingers tracing the black edge of a petal as if it were a sacred relic. He stared at it, then at the journal, then back at the rose. For a full minute, he said nothing. He just looked. "My God," he whispered, finally looking up at me, his eyes wide. How did he stabilize the delphinidin? This shouldn't be possible. He spent the next hour peppering me with questions, his initial politeness replaced by a torrent of scientific curiosity. He understood Arthur's notes in a way I never could, pointing out complex gene splicing notations and cross-pollination charts that were, to me, just elegant scribbles. He saw the genius I had only ever seen as passion. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice now filled with a reverence that brought a lump to my throat. "Your husband wasn't just a gardener, he was a pioneer. This isn't just a pretty flower. If this is a stable, reproducible cultivar, it's priceless, priceless." That word hung in the air, while Michael and Jennifer were squabbling over the resale value of a dining room table. Arthur's true legacy was sitting on a university desk, stunning a leading expert into silence. Dr. Thorne became my first true ally. He agreed to run a full genetic analysis on the rose, to verify its uniqueness and stability. He treated Arthur's journals with the care of a museum curator handling the Dead Sea Scrolls. He saw the value. He saw Arthur, and in doing so he saw me. He never once asked about my family or my finances. He only talked about the rose, about Arthur's incredible foresight and meticulous work. For the first time since Arthur died, I felt like a person again, not a problem to be managed. My second call was to a woman named Evelyn Caldwell, a patent attorney Dr. Thorne had recommended. She was the opposite of Eris Thorne. Where he was a whirlwind of academic passion, she was an island of calm corporate efficiency. She specialized in intellectual property, specifically in agricultural and botanical patents. She came to the house, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit that seemed to repel dust and disorder. We sat at the dining table, the very one Michael had appraised with his greedy eyes. I served her tea in my best china. She listened to my story without interruption, her face unreadable. She reviewed Dr. Thorne's preliminary findings and a few of Arthur's key journals. I expected her to be dismissive, to treat me like a sentimental old woman. Instead, she was methodical. "The key here, Regina," she said, and I noted she used my first name, "is the documentation. Your husband's journals are our greatest asset. They establish a clear, dated history of creation that, combined with Dr. Thorne's genetic verification of its uniqueness, makes for a very strong case for a plant patent." She then laid out the process, the costs, the timelines. It was complex, a world of legal jargon and bureaucratic hurdles. This is where I could have been tripped up by the details, the debatable inaccuracies of the real world. She spoke of utility patents versus plant patents, of the need to prove the hybrid was not an obvious extension of existing species, of the international treaties that govern such things. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood her confidence. "There's a potential issue," she warned, her gaze steady. "Your husband is deceased. His rights to this intellectual property would typically pass to his estate. If your children are the heirs to that estate, they would have a claim." My heart sank. For a moment I saw their smug faces, snatching this away from me too. "The will," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Arthur's will leaves everything to me, unconditionally. I am the sole heir and executrix." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Evelyn Caldwell's lips. "Well," she said, "that simplifies things considerably. The patent would be yours and yours alone." It was a crucial detail, a piece of foresight from my darling Arthur that he could never have known would be so important. He had trusted me completely, and in doing so he had given me the one shield I needed to protect his work from the very children he had tried so hard to appease. The next few weeks were a blur of quiet activity. I became a secret agent in my own life. By day I was the grieving widow, pottering around the house, politely deflecting my children's probing phone calls. "Yes, dear, I'm fine. No, I haven't found all the paperwork yet. It's so overwhelming. Of course we'll talk on Saturday, dear." But by night, and during the long afternoons, I was in mission control. I was on the phone with Evelyn, faxing her signed documents. I was meeting with Eris, who was now working with a small dedicated team to formally map the Crimson Legacy's genome. I learned more about anthocyanin pigments and vegetative reproduction than I ever thought possible. I was alive with a purpose that hummed through my veins like a current. Beatrice was my co-conspirator. She'd come over, and we'd sit on the porch, sipping iced tea, while I gave her the updates. She was thrilled, a giddy accomplice in my silent rebellion. "They're still arguing about the silver. You know," she told me, one afternoon having run into Jennifer at the grocery store. "Jennifer is worried Michael will try to have it appraised by a friend of his to lowball her." We both looked at the Crimson Legacy's bush, standing proudly in the afternoon sun. I thought of its unique genetic code, a secret worth millions, and I thought of my children fighting over the value of a few silver spoons. And for the first time in a long time, I laughed. A deep, genuine laugh that came from my soul. They saw the assets, but they would never ever see the true value. Evelyn Caldwell moved with terrifying speed. She saw the potential and knew that a discovery of this magnitude would attract attention. She told me that several large-scale floral distributors were always on the lookout for a hero product, a unique, resilient, and beautiful flower that could dominate the market for Valentine's Day, for Mother's Day, for anniversaries. The Crimson Legacies with its impossible color and remarkable hardiness. It was, as Arthur had designed, incredibly resistant to common fungal diseases, was more than a hero, it was a dynasty. She discreetly put out feelers, using her high-level contacts. It wasn't an open auction. It was a series of quiet, confidential conversations with the biggest players in the global floral industry. The interest was immediate and intense. They flew in their own botanists, who signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements before even stepping foot in my garden. They took samples under Eris Thorne's watchful eye. The offers started coming in. They were staggering. I was in my kitchen wiping down the counters when Evelyn called. It was a Thursday, 2 days before the family meeting. My hands were steady. My heart was calm. "Regina," she said, her voice even but with an undercurrent of excitement I could now detect. "Global Bloom International has made a final offer. They are prepared to purchase the exclusive global patent and all breeding rights for the cultivar currently known as the Crimson Legacy. The offer is for $12 million. $12 million. I sat down at my small kitchen table. I looked out the window at the bird feeder Arthur had built. A little house finch was pecking at the seeds. The world just kept on turning. The number was so large it felt unreal, like a misprint. It was an amount that didn't just dwarf the estate my children were obsessed with, it rendered it utterly insignificant. It was a rounding error. The funds would be wired to a new trust account, Evelyn continued, her voice pulling me back to reality. One that you and you alone control. It would be completely separate from your husband's estate. It is not inheritance. It is income you have generated. It is yours. I thought of Michael's condescending lectures on financial planning. I thought of Jennifer's casual requests for thousands of dollars. I thought of their email, their scheduled meeting to finalize my arrangements. "Yes, Evelyn," I said, my voice clear and firm, "we accept the offer." The first sign that the world had tilted on its axis from their perspective was subtle. The following Monday, 5 days after I had become a multimillionaire, a professional landscaping crew arrived at my house. Not a couple of guys with a lawnmower, but a full team from a high-end botanical design firm recommended by Eris Thorne. They had trucks with logos, uniforms, and an array of gleaming equipment. They weren't there to mow the lawn. They were there to install a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled greenhouse for the propagation of the Crimson Legacy's descendants, and to professionally curate the rest of Arthur's garden. My phone rang before the first shovel hit the dirt. It was Michael. "Mother, what's going on? Your neighbor just called me. He said there's a fleet of trucks at the house. Are you selling?" His voice was sharp with alarm. "Of course not, dear," I said, my tone placid. "I'm just having some work done in the garden." It was getting to be too much for me. There was a pause. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the mental calculation of the cost. "That looks expensive," he said, the accusation plain in his voice. "Is that really a wise use of funds right now? We need to be preserving the estate's capital, not spending it on petunias. I think your father would want his garden to be cared for properly," I replied sweetly, and I could feel his frustration crackling through the phone. They saw the garden as a liability, something that would need to be cleared to improve the property's curb appeal for a future sale. They couldn't comprehend investing in it. The first move had been made. A silent public declaration that I was operating under a new set of rules. Their panic, however, didn't truly begin until the letter from Evelyn Caldwell arrived. She had advised it as a necessary legal step. It was a simple, formal notification sent to both Michael and Jennifer. It stated that, as executrix of Arthur Miller's estate, I had established a new legal entity, the Arthur Miller Legacy Trust, into which all marital assets, the house, the stocks, the savings, were being transferred for my sole benefit and management during my lifetime. It didn't mention the rose. It didn't mention $12 million. It was a dry legal document, but its implications were explosive. By moving everything into a trust that I alone controlled, I had effectively locked them out. The assets were no longer just sitting in an account with my name on it, an account they imagined they could one day control through power of attorney or inheritance. The money was now behind a legal fortress, and I was the only one with the key. My phone started ringing almost immediately. First Jennifer, her voice a high-pitched shriek. "What is this, Mom? A trust? What are you doing? You can't just move everything around without talking to us." Michael says this is a very aggressive legal move. I let her vent. Listening to the torrent of accusations, she accused me of being manipulated, of being senile, of being deliberately cruel. "This is our family legacy you're playing with," she cried. "No, dear," I said calmly. "It's my life, and your father's legacy. I'm just ensuring it's managed correctly." He tried a different tactic, the voice of calm, condescending reason. "Mother, I've seen the letter from this Caldwell woman. I think you're getting some very bad advice. Setting up an irrevocable trust like this can have massive tax implications. It's not something you should do on a whim. We need to sit down with my financial advisor and undo this before it's too late." "Thank you for your concern, Michael," I said, the words feeling delicious on my tongue. "But I'm very comfortable with my legal counsel. Evelyn is extremely competent." "Who is she?" he demanded. "How did you even find her?" "A friend recommended her," I said, picturing Beatrice's triumphant grin. They were flailing, completely baffled. They couldn't understand where this was coming from. In their world, I was a passive, slightly confused old woman who was supposed to be docilely waiting for them to sort out my life. This sudden, decisive action didn't compute. They had a script for my character, and I was refusing to say my lines. The panic escalated over the next few days. They began a coordinated campaign, a barrage of texts and voicemails, swinging wildly between feigned concern and outright threats. "Mom, we're worried you're having a cognitive episode. Please call us." "Mother, if you don't reverse this, you'll force us to explore our legal options to protect you from yourself. Protect me from myself." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. They weren't trying to protect me. They were trying to protect their anticipated inheritance. They had always mistaken my quiet nature for weakness, my grief for incompetence. They had no idea I had been busy building a fortress while they were drafting their battle plans. The true beauty of my plan, as designed by the brilliant Evelyn Caldwell, was its quiet strength. I didn't need to shout or argue, I just needed to act. The trust was legal. The will was clear. My competency was unassailable, as certified by a doctor in a consultation Evelyn had insisted upon. They had no leverage. Their power over me had always been an illusion, built on my willingness to keep the peace and their belief in their own entitlement. Now that I had called their bluff, they had nothing. The family meeting they had scheduled for that Saturday was now just a few days away. Their tone in the texts grew more desperate. "We are coming on Saturday as planned, and this lawyer of yours had better be there." Michael texted, I replied with a simple, "I look forward to seeing you both." The silent takeover was nearly complete. They thought they were coming to the house to corner me, to force my hand. They still believed they were in charge. They had no idea they were walking into a new reality, one that I had built, brick by silent brick, right under their noses. They were coming for a reckoning, but it wasn't going to be mine. The days leading up to the scheduled meeting were a storm of emotional manipulation. The texts and calls from Michael and Jennifer became a tag team assault, a symphony of guilt, anger, and manufactured concern. Jennifer favored the wounded daughter approach. She'd leave tearful voicemails, her voice cracking as she spoke of how hurt she was by my secrecy. "I just don't understand why you're shutting us out, Mom." She'd weep into the phone. "After everything we've been through, don't you trust us? I feel like I don't even know who you are anymore." It was a masterful performance, one she had honed over years of getting her way. She was playing the victim, casting me as the cold, unfeeling matriarch. Michael's strategy was to attack my competence. He left clipped, business-like messages referencing articles about elder financial abuse and the dangers of predatory advisors. He positioned himself as the reluctant hero, forced to consider drastic measures for my own good. "Mother, I've spoken with a family law attorney," he said in one message, his voice heavy with false regret. "He says, if you continue down this path, we may have to petition for a conservatorship. We don't want to do that. But you are leaving us no choice. We are responsible for your well-being." A conservatorship. The threat was as absurd as it was insulting. It was their ultimate fantasy to have me declared legally incompetent, so they could finally get their hands on the assets they so firmly believed were theirs. They were trying to cage me, to put me in a box labeled helpless old woman's, so they could control the contents. They began to turn on each other too. Beatrice, my loyal intelligence officer, reported on a conversation she'd overheard between them at the pharmacy. They were arguing in hushed, angry tones near the prescriptions counter. Jennifer was accusing Michael of being too aggressive, of spooking me with his legal threats. "You and your spreadsheets, Michael, you have the emotional intelligence of a rock. You've pushed her away." Michael, in turn, blamed Jennifer's extravagant lifestyle. "Maybe if she hadn't just watched you burn through $50,000 on your kitchen remodel, she wouldn't be so worried about the money," he'd hissed back. "She sees you as a black hole of debt, and frankly I'm starting to agree." It was classic. They were so certain the issue was about the money, so focused on the dwindling pile of what they considered their inheritance, that they were tearing each other apart. They couldn't conceive of another motive for my actions. They couldn't imagine that I might want a life of my own, a legacy for my husband that had nothing to do with them. The most desperate counter move came on the Friday before the meeting. They showed up at the house, unannounced. I saw Michael's car pull into the driveway from the kitchen window. I felt a flicker of the old panic, the instinct to smooth things over, to open the door and absorb their anger. But then I looked over at the vase on my counter, holding a single perfect bloom of the Crimson Legacy, and the feeling vanished. It was replaced by a calm, cool resolve. I didn't answer the door. I watched them through the peephole. They rang the bell, then banged on the door, their faces growing red with frustration. "Mom, we know you're in there," Jennifer shouted, her voice shrill. "Open the door. We need to talk." Michael tried the handle, finding it locked. He peered through the front window, trying to see inside. They looked like thwarted burglars. For 20 minutes they pleaded, demanded, and threatened through the solid oak of my front door. It was a complete power shift. For my entire adult life, they had been able to summon me, to command my attention and my resources with a single phone call. Now they were on the outside, locked out of a house they already considered theirs, and I was on the inside, in complete control. This was the family exodus, but not in the way they imagined. It wasn't about me leaving them, it was about me removing them from the center of my life. I was revoking their access, not just to my home, but to my peace of mind. As I listened to their muffled shouts fade as they finally gave up and drove away, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a quiet, profound sense of peace. The silence they left behind was no longer tinged with grief. It was clean, it was mine. I spent that evening preparing, not by gathering financial documents for them, but by arranging a small display on the coffee table in the living room. I placed 3 of Arthur's most detailed journals there. Next to them, I set the original patent application filed by Evelyn, and in the center, in a simple crystal vase, I placed a bouquet of Crimson Legacy's roses, their deep red petals glowing under the lamplight. It was all the evidence I needed. The rest was just a conversation, one they had demanded, and one they were about to deeply regret. Saturday arrived, a bright, clear spring day. The air was full of the scent of the newly tended garden. At exactly 2 p.m., the doorbell rang. I took a deep, steadying breath, walked to the door, and opened it. Michael and Jennifer stood on the porch, their faces grim and determined. They looked like a delegation arriving to negotiate a surrender. "My surrender, Mother," Michael said, striding past me into the foyer as if he owned the place. Jennifer followed, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. They didn't hug me. They didn't even make eye contact for more than a second. "Michael, Jennifer, please come into the living room," I said, my voice even. They marched in and stopped short. They saw the display on the coffee table. Jennifer's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Michael picked up one of the journals, flipping through it with a dismissive air. "More of Dad's old gardening notes," he said, putting it down. They completely ignored the roses. Of course they did. To them, flowers were just decoration. "All right, Mom," Michael began, taking charge. "Let's not beat around the bush. Jennifer and I are extremely concerned. This trust you've set up, this lawyer, you're being manipulated. We're here to put a stop to it. We're here to help you, Mom," Jennifer added, her voice dripping with condescension. "We've already spoken to a lawyer who can dissolve the trust. We just need your signature. It's for the good of the family. For the good of the family." The phrase they had used my entire life to justify their own selfishness. I sat down in my armchair, the one Arthur always used to sit in, and gestured to the sofa opposite me. They remained standing, a united front of indignation. "I won't be dissolving the trust," I said quietly. "You're not well, Mother," Michael snapped. "You're not thinking clearly, you're grieving." "I have never thought more clearly in my entire life," I replied, my gaze level. I looked from his angry face to Jennifer's petulant one. "For years I have watched the two of you. I watched you take from your father. I watched you take from me. You never saw the giving, only the getting. When he died, you didn't see a grieving widow. You saw a speed bump on the road to your inheritance." "That is not true," Jennifer protested, her voice rising. "We love you. Do you?" I asked. A genuine question. "Do you know my favorite color, my favorite book? Do you know what I'm afraid of, or what makes me laugh?" The silence in the room was my answer. You don't, because you've never asked. You've never looked past my function as your mother and your financier. I paused, letting the words sink in. Their expressions shifted from anger to confusion. This was not the conversation they had prepared for. You've spent the last month fighting, I continued. You've argued about this house, about the stocks, about the antique furniture. You've been carving up my life like it's a pie you can't wait to eat. You were so busy counting the silverware that you missed the treasure. I gestured to the roses on the table. You see these? You've seen them in the garden 100 times. You probably thought they were pretty, but you never saw them. You never asked about them. I picked up the patent application. Your father was a genius. He wasn't just a man who liked to garden. He was a brilliant, self-taught horticulturalist. And that rose, I said, my voice thick with emotion, is his masterpiece. It's a genetically unique hybrid he spent 15 years of his life creating. He called it the Crimson Legacy. I watched their faces. They were blank, uncomprehending. They still didn't get it. While you two were busy scheduling meetings to discuss my final arrangements, I was meeting with botanists. I was meeting with patent lawyers. I held up the application. This is the patent for the Crimson Legacy's rose. It belongs to me. Michael let out a short, humorless laugh. A patent for a flower? Mother, what are you talking about? What is that possibly worth? And there it was, the only question that mattered to them. What is it worth? A week ago, I said, my voice dropping, I sold the exclusive worldwide rights to your father's rose to a global floral distributor. I paused, looking directly into Michael's eyes, then Jennifer's. I sold it for $12 million. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Jennifer's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Michael's face went pale, a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. The number just hung there, impossible and immense. 12 million, Jennifer finally whispered, stumbling into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her. Michael just stared at me, his mind clearly racing, trying to process, to recalculate. That's part of the estate, he stammered. That money belongs to the family. No, I said, my voice like ice. It does not. The rose was my intellectual property, created after the will was written. The money is mine. It is in a private account that has nothing to do with the estate you were so worried about. It is beyond your reach. I let them absorb that for a moment before delivering the final blow. The house, the stocks, the savings, everything you were fighting over are in the Arthur Miller Legacy Trust. As you know, the income from that trust will support me for the rest of my life. And upon my death, I said, looking at their horrified faces, the principal, in its entirety, will be donated to the National Horticultural Society to create a scholarship for young botanists in your father's name. His true legacy will be helping others create, not helping you consume. I stood up. You will inherit nothing from me, not the house, not the stocks, not a single rusty dime. You will get the two things you've given me for the past 20 years, my best wishes and my absence. The confrontation was over. The new reality had been delivered. I asked them to leave my house. And for the first time in their lives, they did exactly as I asked, stumbling out in a daze, the architects of their own ruin. It's been a year now. The silence in my house, is a comfortable companion. It's filled not with absence, but with peace. The professional gardeners keep Arthur's sanctuary pristine, and the new greenhouse is nurturing hundreds of tiny Crimson Legacies roses, preparing them for their debut on the world stage. I established the Arthur Miller Scholarship Fund 6 months ago, and I've already read the first round of applications from bright, passionate young students. Their essays, filled with dreams of creating new life from soil and sun, are the most beautiful things I have ever read. I hear things, of course. Beatrice keeps me updated. Michael and Jennifer, stripped of their expected inheritance and the safety net they never knew they had, have had a difficult year. Michael had to sell his oversized house. His mortgage was predicated on a future windfall that never came. Jennifer's consulting business dried up without the constant cash infusions, and she had to get an actual 9-to-5 job. Last I heard, they were barely speaking to each other, each blaming the other for misplaying their hand, for angering the goose that laid the golden eggs. They got what they deserved, I suppose, not because I wished them ill, but because they were finally forced to live with the consequences of their own characters. Sometimes I sit in the garden and think about it all. Was it revenge? Maybe in the end it was. But it didn't start that way. It started as an act of preservation. They weren't just trying to take my money. They were trying to take my future. They were trying to edit me out of my own life story. They saw me as a placeholder, a dot on a timeline between their father's life and their inheritance. What they never understood is that my life didn't end when Arthur's did. It just entered a new chapter. You see, they made a critical mistake. They thought the battle was about the will, the estate, the physical things Arthur left behind. They thought they could win by being the loudest, the most demanding, the most ruthless. But the real legacy wasn't in a safe deposit box. It was growing silently in the garden, a testament to love and patience and genius. They were so focused on the material wealth they could see that they were blind to the incredible value of what was hidden in plain sight. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about respect. Respect for me, respect for their father, and respect for a lifetime of work they had dismissed as a hobby. The $12 million was just a tool. It was the wrecking ball that allowed me to demolish the prison of their expectations and build a new life from the foundations up, a life of my own design. I am Regina, not a wife, not a mother, not an occupant, just Regina. And for the first time, that feels like more than enough. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or taken for granted, know that your value is not determined by how others see you. It's determined by what you choose to cultivate in your own garden. Don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and please subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding your strength when you need it most. And I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think I went too far, or did they get exactly what they had coming?